right, so last week we introduced the book of Daniel, and we talked about the fact that this book is actually, the Bible roots this book in time, okay? And so specifically it kind of picks up in 605 BC with the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem. And so that's when Nebuchadnezzar shows up and he carts off the royal family and some of the nobles and he takes them back to Babylon. And then in 586 BC, the city of Jerusalem is completely destroyed. And that includes the temple, all right? And Daniel is one of the young people that's taken away from Jerusalem, and this is the time period that he's writing in. And so we also, last week, went over the three threads that are woven through this book that we presented as three questions. And so Daniel's interacting with these questions that are, why are we here in Babylon? Or like, kind of why did this happen? How do we live while we're in exile in this foreign place? And then finally, he's asking the question, where does it all go from here? All right, how does history unfold? And so this, like, giant catastrophe has happened. Okay, it seems to these people like the end of the world. All right, God's enemies have been victorious. Their cities destroyed, the temple's gone. And then through a series of visions that God gives to Daniel, especially in the second half of this book, God assures Daniel that the future is under the total sovereign control of God. All right, and that he will hear the pleas of his people, and he will act, and he will accomplish the purposes that he set out to accomplish on the earth. And so these are kind of the themes that we're working with as we study this book. And this morning, we're going to focus on the second one of those themes or questions, and that was, how is it that we're supposed to live while we're in exile? All right. And for just a reminder of the context here, the Babylonians have led the remainder of the Israelites into captivity in their capital city. And we read these two verses last week, and they basically just say that Babylon conquered Judah. So I'm not reading them again. All right, and then in verse 3, it says, Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, the chief of his officials, to present some of the sons of Israel, including some of the royal family and of the nobles. So Nebuchadnezzar is having his chief select out the best and the brightest from the young people of Israel. And it says, youths in whom was no defect, who were good-looking, intelligent in every branch of learning, endowed with understanding, and who had ability for serving in the king's court. And he ordered him to teach them the literature and the language of the Babylonians. The king appointed for them a daily ration of his choicest food and wine, and appointed them to be educated 3 years, at the end of which they were to enter the king's personal service. All right, so like just for a bit of history here, the Babylonians essentially took over what was the Assyrian Empire, and the Assyrian Empire was a brutal place. Okay, they impaled their conquered peoples. That's pretty much the extent of their interaction with foreign cultures. It was basically just wholesale slaughter of anyone who opposed them. And anyone they didn't kill, they forced to intermarry in order to erase any kind of like ethnic identity other than their own. And the Babylonians did things very, very differently. Okay, empire building looked quite different to them. And so just like it says here, they took the best and the brightest from all of the conquered peoples and they brought them back to Babylon to enter into the king's personal service. Okay, they're like educated and refined, and then they would be sent back as like governors to the areas that they came from to essentially act as tools of the Babylonian Empire. And the Romans kind of operated in a similar way with their ethnarchs. And so Daniel and a few of his buddies are probably teenagers at this point, And they're among those that are selected for this like grooming to be in service to the king. And it says that they were to be educated for 3 years. Okay, and so they're kind of like at the University of Babylon, getting like a master's degree in Babylonian culture. All right, so they're going to be experts in the literature and the language of the Babylonians. They're learning the legal system. The Babylonians actually had quite a sophisticated legal system for their day. They had very extensive religious literature and also non-religious literature for these guys to learn. And there was also a distinct Babylonian outlook on the world that was being impressed on these guys. They're really trying to take these young minds and enrich them as much as they could in 3 years, and they're trying to get them to embrace Babylonian culture and see the world through Babylonian eyes. All right, and so they're really trying to give them a Babylonian worldview. And so these guys would still look ethnically Jewish. Okay, they'd still speak their native language, but internally, at the end of this time, they would be Babylonian. That's kind of the idea. Okay, and so it also says that they were to be given a daily ration of the choicest food and wine. Okay, this is a privileged place that these guys are being put in. They're essentially living in the king's palace. They're not living like the refugees that they actually were. Okay, they're being given the best that Babylon has to offer, and the king is really trying to win them over. He's appealing to them and trying to win their favor, and they're getting the best food and the best wine, and all the best things that are going on at the palace are pretty much open to these guys. And so that's kind of the setting for what we're going to talk about this morning. And then verse 6, 5, it says, 5, 7. I don't know. Something's wrong there, isn't it? I think that's 6. That looks like 6. Among the ones chosen from the tribe of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. Then the commander of the officials assigned new names to them. Daniel was called Belteshazzar. Hananiah was called Shadrach. Mishael was called Meshach. Azariah was called Abednego. All right, so what's up with that? Okay. What does it look like to live in exile? And part of what it looks like to live in exile is an attack on your identity. They're changing their names. Okay, and so in the modern world, may not seem like such a big deal. Our names often don't mean very much. If your name is Sean, then your parents probably agreed on it because it was the only name on a list that they made together that one or the other of them did not object to. Okay, and so you could have just as easily been named Willie, and it wouldn't have made any difference because the name doesn't mean anything anyway. All right, so the name Lola is ultimately from Dolores, and it means Lady of Sorrows. Certainly not true of Lola and has nothing to do with what her mother and I hope for her life. Okay, we just like the name. So as a culture, we're a long way removed from the meaning of names. And that wasn't so in the ancient world. All right, they would name children in a way that reflected aspects of their worldview, or that communicated personality traits that they saw in the child, or things that they hoped would be true for the child's life. Okay, names meant a lot to them. And the Babylonians changed these names. Okay, Daniel means God is my judge. And his name was changed to glorify the god Marduk, who was commonly referred to as Bel, all right, which means Lord. Belteshazzar means Bel is my provider. All right. Hananiah means Yahweh is gracious. So his name was changed to Nabu is gracious. Mishael means who is like God, and this was predictably changed to who is like Molech. And Azariah means Yahweh has helped. And Abednego means Nego is my helper. So they're basically going right at the heart of what these people believe by changing what they're called. And they're really working this identity thing. Okay, they are trying to reprogram how these guys view themselves. And it's not just a changing of their names. There's a deliberate process of socialization going on here. Okay, there's their education, and there is access to all of the finest things that Babylon has to offer. And we can see that they're trying to shape these guys' aspirations. Okay, they're giving them what is essentially a promising future, and that they can go that can go a long way with the young people. Okay, answer the question: how is their life actually going to spin out? All right, is it going to be a positive thing? All right, that was pretty much taken care of for these guys. Nebuchadnezzar is giving them a future. They're going to be wealthy and above the rest of the people. And they're playing to this perceived need for a future and a sense of success. And they're trying to play with their affections. Okay, these guys are having their tastes refined so that they want to maintain those tastes. They're being given the finest foods and the finest wines. And probably most importantly, they're trying to reorient their entire worldview. Okay, this is how they want them to look at life and look at reality. And the thought here is that if they can mix up the grid a little bit and get these guys to look at things from the Babylonian perspective and with an eye towards the things that Babylon wants to accomplish, then they'll really have the loyalty of these guys. They'll essentially have their heart. Okay, the Babylonians are trying to adjust how these guys decide what is beautiful and what is desirable and what God is like. It's essentially a brainwashing that they're being subjected to. All right? And there's a very important truth for us here. Okay, we need to be aware of how our culture fosters spiritual conformity. Okay, as the Bible reflects on Babylon, especially in the book of Revelation, it refers to Babylon as sort of like a picture of the world culture. And that's the part of the world culture that's a long way from God. It's a place of corrupt and conforming influences that vie for the loyalty of the people of God. Okay, it seeks to separate us from our connection to God. And it really is just seeking to convert us into people that are essentially just like living for the stimulation of nerve endings and for pleasure, and who have no real sense of who we are and what we're about and what really matters anyway. Okay, we live in a world that is not spiritually neutral, just like Babylon, and there is a conforming influence that's not from God on the thinking and the value system and the passions on all of us inside this culture. Okay, and it's really concerning that as Christians, we're often just unaware of those things that are trying to conform us to a way of living and a way of viewing ourselves that's not in line with how God sees those things. Okay, Paul even says explicitly in Romans 12 to be not conformed to this world. Okay, and this is exactly the framework that Daniel's living in. Okay, it's really clear that he is living in this pagan land and that there are forces that are vying for his heart. Okay, but that is also very, very true for us. Okay, we're not going to delve super deeply into this right now, but I'll come back to it later. For right now, we're going to move forward. Right now, we're going to talk about this in terms of what alternatives there are to this pressure to conform. And so the first option is to just assimilate. Okay, these are the new rules. This is the way that things are. I'm going to play the game. I'll find my faith within the thought forms of the culture that I'm living in. Okay, I'm really just going to be Babylonian. Most of us are somewhat uncomfortable with sticking out much anyway. It can be awkward, sometimes embarrassing to be very different. So we just assimilate. Okay, we're very much like everybody else. People are really good at this. Okay, sadly, God's people have been very good at this. Whatever the culture values, that's what we value. Okay, whatever the culture is about, that's what we're about. We just get sucked in. But that is not going to be the example that Daniel sets for us. Okay? At the other end of the spectrum is for us to separate from the culture. Babylon is bad. God is good. Okay, so I move away from Babylon and I become anti-cultural. Whatever the culture seems to value on any level, I'm going to stand against it. Okay, if the culture likes to dance, then dancing becomes a sin. If the culture likes to drink, then alcohol's from Satan. So Protestant Christianity has an entire tradition of separating themselves from everybody else, and we like to separate to the point that we become completely irrelevant to the culture that we exist within. Okay, so there must be another answer. And that's the answer that Daniel gives us. There's a third way to deal with the enormous power that culture has to cause us to conform. All right, so without assimilating and just like aping the culture around us on one hand, or hiding from the culture in our insulated little bubble on the other hand. Okay, there are two things that we're going to see in the book of Daniel and in the decisions that Daniel makes in this chapter. And the first is that he's going to identify what it means to be different in an important way. Okay, secondly, then Daniel is going to talk about what it means to take that difference and turn it into a blessing and an opportunity for the people that he's been sent to. All right, and these are really important lessons for us as Christians because the Bible describes the life of the Christian as a life in exile. Hebrews 12 says that we are exiles like Abraham was. We're not at home in this world. Okay, we seek a heavenly kingdom. We seek something more than what's here. And how is it that we do that and live in this world? And Daniel provides a very cool picture of just what that looks like. Verse 8 says, "But Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or wine." All right, so that's where Daniel's drawing the line. Seems strange, but it goes on to say, "So he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself." Now God granted Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the commander of the officials. And the commander said to Daniel, "I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has appointed your food and drink. For why should he see your faces looking more haggard than the youths who are your own age? Then you would make me forfeit my head to the king." But Daniel said to the overseer, whom the commander of the officials appointed over them, "Please test your servants for 10 days, and let us be given some vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance be observed in your presence in the appearance of the youths who are eating the king's food, and deal with your servants according to what you see." So he agreed and tested them for 10 days. At the end of 10 days, they looked healthier than all the youths who ate the king's food. So the overseer continued to withhold the king's food and wine and fed them only vegetables. So what are we talking about here, right? Daniel is coming to a place where he's decided to be different. All right, Daniel and his friends want to be different, and they're representing that here through eating just vegetables and water. And he uses the words that he doesn't want to defile himself. All right, seems like a pretty strong word, frankly. It means to like bring filthiness upon your conscience and to compromise your standards, right? And so this is really about matters of conscience. And that's what's at stake here for Daniel. And so I think we need to think about that, because this is the place right here that being different mattered to Daniel. And by matters of conscience, I mean decisions that affect how you live your life before God. All right, God is an audience of one. And it's pretty interesting in this story that Daniel and his friends do not go advertising that they've become vegetarians. Okay, nobody even knows except the four of them and this guy that's responsible for feeding them. They're not like staging protests. This is not some sort of campaign to get other people to do the same thing. Okay, this whole thing is just between these guys and God. It's not their peers that they answer to. It's just God. And that's exactly what a matter of conscience is. It doesn't matter what your neighbor thinks or what your boss thinks or what your spouse thinks. Those things might matter some in certain situations, but what ultimately matters is what God thinks of a decision. Is God honored by your decision to live your life in a certain way? Okay, that's a matter of conscience. And in this context, this means a few things. Okay, they're talking about food here, and I find it quite difficult to view food as a matter of conscience. Okay, but to a Jewish person, food could be a significant moral issue. All right, they've got all their kosher laws and stuff like that. But in this case, it doesn't really look like the dietary laws of the Old Testament are even in view. It's not what Daniel's talking about. Daniel's not drinking wine, and wine is not banned by Jewish dietary laws. All right, so that's not what this is about. Daniel's making a decision that is not really about good versus bad, as some conscious decisions really are. And on the authority of Paul in 1 Corinthians 8, food is one of those things that, like, it basically just goes in one hole and out the other. Okay? It's not of any major moral importance. But for Daniel and his friends, it was important. And it's actually not completely clear why that is. It could be that the food that was from the king's table had already been dedicated to the Babylonian gods. And so in the eating of the food, you could say that in some remote sense you were worshiping the Babylonian gods. Okay, but in chapter 10, verse 3, Daniel says that he's gone on a fast. And he's no longer eating the fine meat and drinking the fine wine that he once did. And so clearly, being a vegetarian is a temporary thing and is not characteristic of Daniel's entire life. Okay, so this may be based on reasons that he doesn't really give us clearly. The point is that this is not necessarily a good versus bad thing. In fact, we may have to make decisions in matters of conscience that can relate to us in lots of ways that are not really moral issues, right? In and of themselves, at least, right? Like our financial values, okay? Maybe like how we connect with our communities, both our geographical communities and our spiritual communities. Okay, or the ways that we involve ourselves with our family. Maybe those are going to end up being a matter of conscience, right? How we prioritize our children and our spouses. How we view work can also be a matter of conscience. Okay, and of course, these things are not matters of good and evil or right and wrong. It's much more subtle than that. Okay, this all operates on the level of individual conscience before God. And we're not very good at this in our culture, right? We're not really conscience-oriented. We're a stimulation-oriented culture. Okay, we just do because we can. And we do not really often consider the question of why. Okay, but Daniel is pretty concerned with just those kinds of questions. And so maybe what we're talking about with matters of conscience is the need to preserve some sort of moral compass. Okay, we need some moral clarity in this very confusing time. And this decision to not eat meat or drink the wine from the king's table would be like a tangible line that these guys are drawing, and they're not going past that line. And that would provide a sense of clarity about their own habits and the things that they're willing to do and not willing to do. And again, I think that would be an important bit of insight for us. And I wonder how many of us really have any boundaries at all in our lives that are not tied up in right and wrong. Okay, do we have explicit principles that guide the important decision making that we do in our lives, that enable us to live with integrity before God? Okay, like these things that we just had on the screen a minute ago. In terms of our financial values, do we have some clarity on what that looks like? All right, so for instance, you might have a commitment to your debt to income ratio. Are you prepared to not go beyond what you can pay off this month? Whatever. All right, the average American household is crippled by consumer debt. Are we prepared to be different in that way? Okay, there are no real parameters in our culture for what that looks like. We have to decide on our own. All right. And what kind of time are you giving to your family involvements? How much time do you spend with your kids and your spouse? Can you be consistent in any of those areas? Some of us don't have any boundaries at all for any of this. And so we've just become just like the rest of our culture. Either we do not really spend any quality time with them at all, or we're vicariously living through our children, or we're mindlessly driving them around to whatever event they seem interested in. Okay, as a culture, we're not leading them, we're indulging them. And as a consequence, we're not helping them. Okay, we got to be able to make decisions that might disappoint them for the sake of their good. So we're not talking about inviolable moral laws. We're talking about healthy frameworks where we can express the caring that we have for our family within that framework. Okay, so how we view our work ethic. That's another important thing that we could think about. Some of us are not working for a living. We are spending our lives at work. Okay, work has become the dominant driver in our life. And we're willing to give a level of commitment to our work life that if it were any other thing that you were as committed to, people would call you a fanatic. Okay, it's like you've joined some kind of cult. And you just have to give all of your resources. It's like you've completely lost your mind. And you have to ask yourself what it is that you're sacrificing to display that level of commitment. Okay, it can be a hard question. And it's a question that may have financial implications. It may have implications with your identity. But it may also open up some doors for things that you really do value, like maybe spending some real time with your family where you're actually awake and you have something to give. Or maybe building a life in your community that makes a difference. Okay, how about if we spend some time serving other people and breaking out of the narcissism that seems to conform the American family into its self-indulgent image, and in so doing, destroy that family? Okay, we need to learn to make decisions for the sake of conscience that we can stand on and that can come to define us. And I fear that most of us in upper middle class Christian America just embrace the corporate culture of whatever's around us. Okay, it's just normal. It's just the way it is. But does it have to be? Right? What's the cost of living this way? And this is the place where we're going to have to make some courageous decisions for the sake of our sanity and for the health of our family and for our relationship with God. All right, so Daniel is making decisions that are rooted in conscience, and we need to be able to do that also, okay, if we're going to be effective in the world. So there's also the idea that maybe Daniel and these other guys take on a vegetarian diet as some kind of statement of solidarity with their fellow exiles. All right, so these guys were the smart ones and the beautiful ones and the ones that were deemed able to be educated. Okay, they're in a place of privilege. They're the elite. And the vast majority of the other people taken into exile lived as refugees. Okay, and it is possible that Daniel and these other guys are trying to avoid elevating themselves way above their brothers and sisters that are basically living on vegetables. Okay, they could be trying to identify with their fellow Israelites instead of identifying with the palace. All right, they may be standing their ground in order to stay connected to their people and how they live, trying to minimize the distance between themselves and the people who are suffering the most in the world that they're in. There's something there for us too. Okay, we should want to be moving toward where people are, not into an increasingly isolated bubble of comfortable affluence in Christendom. Okay, we do have the capacity and the inclination to just hole up. And that's pretty much disastrous on every level. Okay, and Daniel just didn't go there. This is also an important thing. I had to wrestle with this a little bit this week as I read this passage over and over again. As Daniel and his friends made this decision to only eat vegetables, they really were making a decision to trust in God. Okay, they're trusting that God would enable them to stay as healthy as the people that were eating the king's food. The text does not exactly say that at the end of the 10 days, if they had not looked so good, that they would go back to eating meat. It doesn't say that. They just put their cards on the table, right? Here I stand. Apart from this, I can do no other. God help me, right? Like that's Martin Luther. And Daniel's saying exactly the same thing. It is neither prudent nor safe to act against your conscience. And these guys are stepping out on the limb and they're making their stand and they're needing to trust in God. And that connection between placing yourself at risk and choosing to be out on the limb is the important part about this. All right, that's the process that enables us to see God at work. It's really hard to see God at work when I'm doing an adequate job on my own. If we're completely self-reliant and we don't have any real need in our life, then we're not going to see God at work because we're not risking anything. And Daniel's prepared to risk. Okay, is there anything really at stake in your spiritual life? Now I know that like many of us know what it's like to be at the place where we are really trusting God. Okay, there are people in this room that have really suffered. We got some things going on, and we have had some things going on. And the amazing part about that is that when this stuff is going on, or right after, the refrain that I hear the most is, it's not, how can this be happening to me? Instead, it's more like, it is so amazing to see God at work. Okay, it's really amazing to see people as they come to the realization that the things that they thought that they relied on, all right, their health or their job or whatever, that's not really what is sustaining them. It's God that's sustaining them. And He manifests Himself as we are struggling with those things. Okay, it's when we encounter something that makes it so that we have to trust God that we get to see Him at work. Okay, but what if it was not the circumstances that forced us to trust God? What if we were making decisions in our lives to be at a place where we must trust God? Then we would also get to see Him at work. Okay, there are some tough and scary decisions that God will call on you to make for the sake of being able to see Him work in your life. All right, they're faith decisions to trust Him and to say no to the things that are not Him, the things that we rely on for security, for our sense of control or whatever. Okay, it's what a life of faith looks like. God's calling on you in an area that is unique to you. Okay, so like, where will you choose to trust God? Where will you take the step of faith that is into the unknown simply because you believe that God is calling you to that? Okay, maybe it's being financially generous to the point that it affects your financial security. Maybe it's setting aside your own holy trinity of me, myself, and I, and deliberately moving into the needs and the interests of another person on a consistent basis, where you're like actually pursuing them and sacrificing them so that you're available to be the tool that God uses in their life, right? Stuff like that. Here's a dangerous prayer for you. Pray that God would show you where He is calling you to take a scary step of trust in Him that will enable you to see just how great God is. Okay, when people pray like that, they begin to see the supernatural, right? Individually and collectively. And it has this effect that we're all like drawn into the significant things of God. Our confidence in God is elevated. We're able to pray for bigger things, and then God moves in an even bigger way. But it all starts right here. All right, with that tough and scary choice that God is asking you to make so that He might manifest His reality to you. All right, so if we're like that, we're going to be different. All right, but in a good way. Not in a weird way that Christians have preferred to be different for most of history. Christians are certainly known for being different. Okay, but the way that Christians have typically chosen to be different is the main reason that people don't want to be Christians. If we were different like Daniel was different, then we're different in a welcoming way that draws people in. Last section, verse 17. God gave the 4 young men knowledge and intelligence in every branch of literature and wisdom. Daniel even understood all kinds of visions and dreams. Then at the end of the days specified by the king, the commander of the officials presented them before Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and out of them all not one was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's personal service. As for every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king consulted them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and priests who were in his kingdom. And Daniel continued until the first year of Cyrus the king. That's in 540 BC. So that's a 65-year run for Daniel. All right, so there's another principle here. We're called to be different for the purpose of making a difference. Okay, it's not just so that we are weird. It's not different for the sake of being different. It's to make a difference. All right, that's the issue here. God blessed Daniel and these other three guys. He prevented them from living the life of a refugee like the rest of his nation. He blessed them so that they could be a blessing. In the generation before Daniel, Jeremiah said, "Seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will have welfare." All right? Do not be resentful. Do not be separatist. Don't write these people off. Seek their welfare. All right, there's like a command here. As God has blessed us, He's given us our blessings for a reason. And that reason is so that we can be a blessing. Okay, so how was Daniel blessed? Well, clearly there was his intellect. Okay, he's a smart guy. Passage says that he was a good-looking guy. He had aristocratic family connections. Okay, he was brought out of Judah with the royal family. And he was given incredible opportunity. Okay, and so here's the deal. Relatively speaking, that is describing you. Okay, now not all of you have all of the blessings of Daniel, but generally speaking, all right, this is a smart and educated bunch of people, well-fed, relatively good-looking, and you don't deserve a single bit of that. Okay, you didn't do a single thing to get any of that. God gave you all that stuff. God gave you your personality, your intellect, your family, your looks, your moment in time, your place on the earth. Those things are all gifts. They're His blessing to you. And He calls on us that have been blessed richly to be a rich blessing to the people that need the blessing of God. Okay, and this says that Daniel was found to be 10 times better than all these other whack jobs that the king had around him. All right, these Hebrew boys took very seriously the opportunity that God had given them. They didn't sit around drinking the king's Merlot and getting fat on the king's mutton chops. They didn't squander their moment. Daniel's familiar with the writings of Jeremiah. He quotes them in chapter 9. And he sees in Jeremiah 29:7 the prescription for what it looks like to live in exile. And he took the opportunity to learn what needed to be learned and excel so that he could work for the welfare of the city that he had been sent to. Okay, these guys mastered the world's wisdom. They mastered the law of the Babylonians. They mastered its religious framework and its literature, all without losing the sense of who they really were. They didn't lose their identity. Okay, the book introduces their Babylonian names, but then it refers to them by their Hebrew names. The Babylonian names never became who they really were. Okay, they drew their conscience-based lines that gave them clarity to sustain real commitment to the things that God had called them to. And with that, they were willing and able to immerse themselves in the learning of the most advanced civilization of their day. Okay, they were people that could be relied on to make a difference for themselves and for their own people and for the Babylonian people. They were willing to get in there and do the work. Okay, and that's also an important lesson for us. Okay, the lesson is that credible people make God a living option for other people. Okay, people who take their station in life seriously and who work hard and who are excellent at the things that they do can be an amazing witness for the people who are looking for God. Okay, Daniel comes to the aid of Nebuchadnezzar. And through the things that he can do and the things that he understands, he's able to make real inroads and be a real witness of who God really is to the Babylonian king. And in that sense, these guys are like emissaries of God in the place that God has called them. Okay, and so where has God called you? And we certainly know that God has called you to a Christian community. Okay, and we know that in one sense, that's the focal point of what God is doing in the world. He's given us the resources to become excellent in the art of Christian love within the Christian community. God has also given us secular vocations, many of us, and a voice in our culture. And God also says to be excellent and to be a witness in that context. As far as you can go within the framework of your conscience, be the best that you can be. Daniel was 10 times better than anybody else. All right, and of course, this is going to create a dynamic tension between being excellent as a witness and excellent at your job. All right, but that's what your conscience is for. It's these two areas of excellence that are what it really means to live in exile. And God is calling on us to have a thought life and to have an attitude and the outlook of an exile. And in the next 6 chapters, we're going to see how that unfolds. But that's all we're going to do for today. Okay, so, yeah.